What if the man mopping floors in one of America's most prestigious art museums had actually created some of the masterpieces hanging on those walls, and nobody knew? Thomas Whitmore, 68, pushed his cleaning cart through the marble halls of the Ashford Museum of Contemporary Art in Manhattan at 6:15 a.m., just as he'd done for the past 22 years. Minimum wage. Night shift. Invisible to the art world elite who walked past him every day. The morning cleaning shift meant he saw everything: wealthy collectors examining paintings worth millions, art critics delivering judgments that could make or break careers, curators discussing acquisitions in hushed, reverent tones. But nobody ever looked at him. Not really. To them, he was just the old janitor. Part of the building, like the marble columns or the security cameras. What they didn't know was that 35 years ago, Thomas Whitmore wasn't pushing a mop. He was Thomas J. Whitmore, one of the most promising abstract expressionist painters of the 1980s. Critics called his work revolutionary. Galleries fought over his pieces. His 1987 painting, Fracture, sold for $340,000, the equivalent of over $900,000 today. Until the night his wife Maria died in a car accident, leaving him with a 6-year-old daughter and crippling grief that made it impossible to pick up a brush for 2 years. By the time Thomas tried to return to painting, the art world had moved on. His gallery dropped him. Collectors forgot his name. And with a daughter to raise and medical bills to pay, Thomas took the only job he could find that let him stay close to art: night janitor at the Ashford Museum. For 22 years, he'd cleaned the halls where his own work once hung. For 22 years, he'd kept his past buried beneath floor wax and industrial cleaners. Until today. This morning, the Ashford Museum was preparing for its biggest event in decades, the unveiling of Convergence, a newly discovered abstract expressionist painting from 1986, purchased at auction for $12 million. The artist, unknown. The painting, a mystery that had captivated the art world for months. And as Thomas stood in the East Gallery at 6:30 a.m., staring at the covered canvas, his hands began to shake. Because he knew exactly who had painted it. He knew because he remembered the night he created it, in his Brooklyn studio, 3 months before Maria's death, in a burst of creative fury that had left him exhausted and exhilarated. He knew because he could see his signature hidden in the lower right corner, partially obscured by the frame but still there, T.J.W. 86. His painting. His masterpiece. Purchased for $12 million by the museum where he mopped floors for $15 an hour. And in exactly 6 hours, at the unveiling ceremony, the entire art world would discover the truth, whether Thomas was ready or not. But first, he had to survive this morning's humiliation from the man who'd made his life hell for 5 years, prestigious art critic Sebastian Hartley. If you believe talent doesn't have an expiration date, comment respect. Thomas Whitmore lived in a rent-controlled studio apartment in Queens, $1,200 a month, everything he could afford on his janitor's salary after helping his daughter Elena through medical school. She was 41 now. Dr. Elena Whitmore, pediatric surgeon. He'd worked double shifts for years to help pay for her education, never telling her about his past as an artist because he didn't want her to feel guilty about his sacrifice. His apartment was small, cluttered, but one corner remained sacred: his old easel, covered with a sheet, surrounded by boxes of dried-out paints he couldn't afford to replace and canvases he'd never finished. He hadn't painted in 22 years. Told himself it was because he didn't have time. But the truth was simpler and more painful: he was afraid. Afraid that the magic was gone. Afraid that returning to art would prove that his brief moment of brilliance had been just that, a moment, not a lifetime. Every morning at 5 a.m., Thomas took the subway from Queens to Manhattan, arriving at the Ashford Museum by 6 a.m. for his shift. He'd clean the galleries before they opened at 10, then leave before the crowds arrived, a ghost in his own former world. The younger museum staff were kind but distant. The curators never spoke to him beyond basic instructions. And Sebastian Hartley, the famous art critic who'd been hired as a consultant 6 months ago, treated him like he was part of the furniture, or worse, an inconvenience. But Thomas endured it because being around art, even as a janitor, was better than being completely cut off from the world that had once defined him. Sebastian Hartley, 52, was everything Thomas wasn't: wealthy, connected, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. He'd built a career not by creating art but by judging it, writing scathing reviews that could destroy emerging artists or effusive praise that could make careers overnight. He consulted for major museums, advised billionaire collectors, and spoke at international art conferences. His signature look, expensive tailored suits, perfectly styled silver hair, and a permanent expression of barely concealed contempt for anyone he deemed intellectually inferior. Which, in Sebastian's view, included pretty much everyone, especially janitors. On this particular morning, Sebastian arrived at the museum at 7 a.m., 3 hours before the unveiling ceremony, to supervise the final preparations. He found Thomas cleaning the marble floor near the covered painting. "You," Sebastian snapped, not bothering with names. "You're leaving streaks. Can you manage to clean a floor without ruining it, or is that beyond your capabilities?" Thomas looked down at the perfectly clean floor, then back at Sebastian. "I'll go over it again, sir." "Do that. And try not to breathe on the painting. God knows what kind of damage proximity to incompetence might cause." Thomas said nothing, just returned to his cart for fresh cleaning solution. Sebastian watched him with barely disguised disdain. 22 years you've worked here, isn't that right? Tell me, in all that time, have you ever actually looked at the art? Or do you just see it as obstacles in your path to the next dirty floor? "I look at the art," Thomas said quietly. "And do you understand any of it?" Sebastian asked with a cruel smile. "Do you comprehend the genius of abstract expressionism, the revolutionary techniques, the cultural significance?" "I understand some of it." Sebastian laughed. "Of course you do. Well, let me educate you, since you're here. This painting," he gestured at the covered canvas, "is a masterwork by an unknown genius. Worth $12 million. More money than you'll make in 10 lifetimes. It represents everything you'll never understand: vision, talent, artistic courage." He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a cruel whisper. "Do you know the difference between you and real artists? Real artists create. They build legacies. They matter. You clean up their messes and collect a paycheck. You're functionally invisible. And that's all you'll ever be." Thomas's hands tightened on his mop handle, but he kept his voice steady. "Is there anything else you need, Mr. Hartley?" "Yes. Disappear. I don't want to see you during the ceremony. Hide in your supply closet or wherever it is people like you go when your betters are working." Thomas nodded slowly and pushed his cart toward the service corridor. What Sebastian didn't know was that Thomas had just made a decision. A decision that would destroy Sebastian's career and change everything. 1986, Brooklyn Studio. 35-year-old Thomas Whitmore stood before a massive canvas in his Brooklyn studio, paint-stained hands moving with furious precision, lost in the kind of creative trance that artists live for. Convergence was coming to life, violent reds colliding with serene blues, geometric precision fighting organic chaos, representing the exact feeling of standing at a crossroads between destruction and hope. His wife Maria watched from the doorway, 7 months pregnant with Elena, a smile on her face. "You're going to be late for the gallery opening," she said gently. 5 more minutes, Thomas replied without looking away. "I need to finish this section while I can still see it clearly." Maria walked over and kissed his paint-stained cheek. "You're brilliant, you know that." "I'm obsessed," Thomas corrected. "There's a difference." "No," Maria said firmly. "You're brilliant. And the world is finally seeing it." She was right. At 35, Thomas J. Whitmore was at the peak of his career. 3 gallery shows in 2 years. Pieces selling for 6 figures. A profile in Art Forum magazine calling him, the voice of a generation grappling with post-industrial anxiety. He finished Convergence 3 days later. And then, because he'd already committed to showing other pieces at his upcoming exhibition, he stored the painting in his studio, planning to unveil it at his next show. That show never happened. 6 weeks later, Maria died when a drunk driver ran a red light on the Brooklyn Bridge. Thomas was left with a 6-year-old daughter, crushing grief, and a creative gift that suddenly felt utterly meaningless. 1988, 2 years later. Thomas tried to return to painting. His gallery was supportive at first, but when months passed and he couldn't produce anything, they grew impatient. "The art world moves fast," his dealer explained apologetically. "If you're not producing, collectors move on." "I'm sorry, Thomas, but I need artists who can deliver." By 1990, Thomas J. Whitmore's name had been forgotten. By 1995, he was working as a night janitor at the Ashford Museum, grateful for steady income and health insurance for Elena. And Convergence? He'd sold it years ago, along with dozens of other pieces, just to pay bills. Sold them cheap to a dealer who'd offered cash and asked no questions. He never imagined that painting would resurface 35 years later, purchased at auction for $12 million, with the art world desperately trying to identify its mysterious creator. At 9:45 a.m., Thomas stood in the museum's basement supply room, staring at his phone. He'd Googled his own name for the first time in years. The search results were sparse, a few auction records from the 1980s, a mention in an old art forum article, nothing recent. Thomas J. Whitmore had been erased from art history. But Convergence hadn't been. He pulled up photos from the auction preview. There, in the lower right corner, partially hidden by the frame, his signature. T.J.W. 86. Nobody had noticed it. Or if they had, they hadn't connected it to him. Why would they? The great Thomas J. Whitmore was dead as far as the art world was concerned. The old janitor mopping floors couldn't possibly be the same person. Thomas thought about Sebastian's words. Functionally invisible. That's all you'll ever be. For 22 years, Thomas had accepted invisibility. Accepted that his moment had passed. Accepted that he was just the janitor now, and that was okay because at least he was near art, even if he couldn't create it anymore. But something about seeing his own masterpiece hanging in the museum where he cleaned floors, something about Sebastian's cruelty, broke something inside him. Or fixed it. Thomas pulled out his phone and called his daughter. "Elena," he said when she answered. "I need you to come to the museum. Today. For the noon unveiling." "Dad, I'm in surgery until." "Cancel it," Thomas said, his voice shaking. "Please. Trust me. You need to be here." There was a pause. "Dad, are you okay?" "I'm about to be," Thomas said. For the first time in 35 years. At 11:45 a.m., the Ashford Museum's East Gallery was filled with Manhattan's art elite. 300 guests in designer clothing, champagne glasses in hand, gathered around the covered Convergence painting. Collectors, critics, gallery owners, museum board members, everyone who mattered in the contemporary art world. Sebastian Hartley stood near the front, holding court with a group of admirers, explaining his theories about the mysterious artist's identity. Clearly someone trained in the European tradition, Sebastian declared confidently. The brushwork suggests formal academy training. Possibly German or Austrian. The composition reflects a deep understanding of color theory that simply doesn't exist in self-taught artists. Museum director Patricia Morrison, 55, stood at the podium, preparing to begin the ceremony. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. As you know, Convergence represents one of the most significant discoveries in abstract expressionism in decades. Purchased at auction for $12 million, this masterwork has captivated experts worldwide. And today, we finally unveil it to the public." The crowd applauded. Patricia continued. "I must acknowledge our consultant, Sebastian Hartley, whose expertise has been invaluable in authenticating this piece and preparing today's exhibition." More applause. Sebastian nodded graciously, soaking in the attention. Now, without further delay, wait. The voice came from the back of the gallery. Quiet but clear, everyone turned. Thomas Whitmore stood in the doorway, no longer in his janitor's uniform but wearing an old suit he'd pulled from the back of his closet, slightly outdated, slightly wrinkled, but clean. His daughter Elena stood beside him, confusion and concern on her face. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Thomas said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "But there's something you should know about that painting." Sebastian's face twisted with irritation. "Security, please remove this man. He's the janitor. He's not authorized." "My name," Thomas said louder, walking forward through the crowd, "is Thomas J. Whitmore. And I painted Convergence in my Brooklyn studio in March of 1986. The gallery went silent. Sebastian laughed. "This is absurd. Patricia, call security." "I can prove it," Thomas interrupted, still walking toward the covered painting. "The signature is in the lower right corner, partially hidden by the frame. T.J.W. 86. My initials and the year I painted it." Patricia Morrison's face had gone pale. "Mr. Whitmore, are you claiming?" "I'm not claiming anything," Thomas said, reaching the painting. "I'm stating a fact. This is my work. I created it 38 years ago. And if you remove the frame, you'll find more than just my signature, you'll find a complete artist statement I wrote on the back of the canvas before I stretched it." Sebastian stepped forward, his face red. "This is ridiculous." Thomas J. Whitmore was a moderately successful artist who disappeared from the scene in the late 1980s. "This man is a janitor. He's delusional." "Actually," said a voice from the crowd. A woman in her 60s stepped forward. Martha Reynolds, one of the museum's oldest board members. "I remember Thomas Whitmore. I saw his exhibition at the Bowery Gallery in 1987. He was extraordinary." She turned to Thomas, studying his face. "My God. It is you. I thought you'd died." "I almost did," Thomas said quietly. "My wife died in 1988. I had a daughter to raise. The galleries moved on. So I moved on too. Became invisible." He turned to Patricia. "For 22 years, I've mopped these floors. I've cleaned the galleries where my own work used to hang. And I never said anything because I didn't think anyone would care. I didn't think it mattered anymore." His eyes found Sebastian. "But today, your consultant, this man who claims to be an expert on art, told me I would never understand genius. That I was functionally invisible. That I was nothing." Thomas stepped to the covered painting. "So I decided it was time to become visible again." He pulled the cloth away. Convergence blazed in the gallery lights, violent reds and serene blues, chaos and order, exactly as Thomas remembered creating it 38 years ago. And in the lower right corner, partially hidden by the frame, T.J.W. 86. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Patricia Morrison strode to the painting, pulled out her phone's flashlight, and examined the signature closely. "Get the frame off," she ordered the museum technician. "Carefully." It took 10 minutes to remove the frame without damaging the canvas. The crowd waited in electric silence. When the frame came off, Patricia carefully turned the canvas around. On the back, written in faded black marker in Thomas's handwriting. Convergence. Thomas J. Whitmore. March 1986. Artist's statement. This painting represents the moment of standing. Between grief and hope, destruction and creation. Ending and beginning. It is dedicated to Maria, who taught me that art is not about perfection. It's about truth. Studio, 347, Bedford Avenue, Brooklyn. Patricia read the statement aloud, her voice shaking slightly. The crowd erupted in whispers. Martha Reynolds stepped forward again. I need to make a call. Patricia, do you have the auction records? I want to verify the provenance trail. While Martha made calls and Patricia pulled up documents, Thomas stood quietly beside his painting, Elena gripping his hand tightly. Dad, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Why didn't you ever tell me? Because I didn't want you to feel guilty, Thomas said softly. I chose to raise you. I chose to give you a future. That was more important than any painting. But you gave up everything. I gave up nothing, Thomas interrupted gently. I gained you. And that was worth more than all the galleries in the world. 20 minutes later, Martha returned with her phone. Patricia, I just spoke with the auction house. They confirmed the provenance trail leads back to a bulk sale in 1992, dozens of paintings sold by an estate dealer in Brooklyn. The seller's name in their records, Thomas J. Whitmore. She turned to Thomas. It's real. You're real. Sebastian Hartley stood frozen, his face cycling through shock, horror, and humiliation. Patricia Morrison took a deep breath and addressed the stunned crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, it appears we've made an extraordinary discovery today. Not just of a painting, but of a living artist we believed was lost to history. She turned to Thomas. Mr. Whitmore, on behalf of the Ashford Museum, I need to apologize. We've had you cleaning our floors for 22 years while your own work hung on our walls. That's unconscionable. You didn't know, Thomas said simply. But we should have, Patricia replied. We should have seen you. We should have asked. We should have cared enough to look beyond the uniform. She glanced at Sebastian, whose expression had turned from humiliation to panic. Mr. Hartley, Patricia said coldly. You claimed expertise in abstract expressionism. You authenticated this painting. You consulted on this acquisition. And yet you didn't recognize Thomas J. Whitmore, a documented artist from that exact era and movement, when he was literally mopping the floor in front of you. Sebastian's mouth opened and closed. He was a minor artist. Insignificant. How was I supposed to? He created the painting you called a masterwork by an unknown genius, Patricia interrupted. The painting you said reflected formal academy training and deep understanding of color theory that doesn't exist in self-taught artists. She pulled out her phone and began typing. I'm terminating your consulting contract, effective immediately. And I'm notifying the other museums and galleries you work with about this spectacular failure of expertise. Sebastian's face went white. You can't. I can, and I am, Patricia said flatly. You humiliated a man who created something you claimed to admire. You're not an expert, Mr. Hartley. You're a fraud with good credentials. And we're done here.